She stumbled from the curb out into the darkness, glancing over her shoulder as her office door firmly shut behind her. She walked in the direction of her home. The quiet suburban streets held a certain quaintness about them. Tall, grand Victorian apartments seemed to weave their way like a snake from the city along the streets that she now walked. She watched as the darkness itself seemed to reluctantly devour the light ahead of her. She was very familiar with her route, the one she took daily after work. She approached an alleyway, checking left and right before casually crossing the street. It was quiet, too quiet for her liking, and with this in mind she took out her mobile phone and plugged in her earphones. The biting cold that seemed mild at first was now numbing her face. She smiled to herself. 80s music seemed to offer her warmth from the inside, taking the very worst of the chill away. There was a sudden, overwhelming, stale smell which made her cover her mouth. The foul odour seemed to dominate the air all around her. There was an almost metallic taste in her mouth. What was this horrible smell she was breathing in, she thought to herself. She quickened her pace, and with every hurried footsteps, the street lamps ahead of her began to pulse. The air around her seemed to flex, and almost instantly it felt several degrees warmer. She power-walked her way further down the street before she suddenly came to a complete stop. There was a glowing park sign directly ahead of her in the street. This was an unexpected sight. The beginning of her street had now been replaced by a huge, red-arched neon sign that simply read, "The Park." This was the same street she walked down every night for years. The park sign seemed to be framed by the sky above, which was now a swirling mass of grey clouds. She was puzzled and confused. She turned around to check that she hadn't lost her bearings in some way. Sure enough, the familiar streets were indeed still behind her. A stillness had fallen over the street. It seemed unusually silent. She cautiously moved forward up the street, slowly pulling out her earphones as she now became more fascinated by this unusual sign ahead of her. It was directly opposite the grand Victorian apartments, where she had expected to see the beginning of her street. She gazed up at the sign towering above her, trying somehow to take all of this in. This wasn't just a sign out of place. Its archway, which was surrounded by thick, heavy cast-iron railings, actually led into a park. It was very ominous, dark, and foreboding. A huge park that had appeared there where her streets had been that morning. It was as if the streets where she lived had been taken away at dusk and replaced with something more sinister. She blinked several times, running her hand through her long dark hair, puzzled at what to do next. Was she to turn around and go back the way she came? And if so, how would she make it home? She looked down at her mobile phone. She felt foolish thinking about calling for a taxi, but all things considered, that was the only thing she could think of doing. She called a taxi company. She now felt something was seriously wrong. She stood there looking at what should have been the end of her street, and yet there before her was this strange park that had appeared out of nowhere. She was contemplating whether or not to ask the taxi driver to take her home, or go straight to hospital. The metallic taste in her mouth returned. Perhaps she had just experienced some form of small stroke or seizure. The phone rang several times. Then a soft voice from the taxi firm answered. "Can I help you?" said the woman on the phone. She gave her location of the street she was now on and her name. "Mystery," she said. "My name is Mystery." There was a long pause, and the phone line crackled. "This is the Airwave Police. Can I help you?" asked a new voice, a very harsh-sounding woman. "The what? The Airwave Police?" Mystery laughed. Her laugh swallowed quickly into the darkness around her. She wondered if she had somehow just called an incorrect number. There was a short pause on the phone line. At first, all she could hear was white noise. Then the woman spoke again, only now more aggressive. "No one can save you here," came the reply, and the line suddenly went dead. Mystery was freaked out by the reply. Things were becoming a bit too weird for her liking. She sighed and tried another taxi firm. She stared at her phone in disbelief. Now there was no longer any signal on her phone. Ahead of her seemed to be an unusually thick stream of fog which frightened her. The silvery mist seemed to lick at every surface before pouring out beyond the railings of the park. "I'm not going in there," she said to herself firmly. After a few moments of waiting for a signal, she sighed, gave up, and made a decision. She took it upon herself to walk back the way she came. Her new plan now was to call a taxi from work. Reluctantly, she turned around to make her way back, only to find that the street she had just walked down was now no longer there. The grand Victorian apartments were still there, but the street and houses that ran alongside them had now completely vanished. Cast-iron railings and a planting that bordered the park now stood proudly in their place, as if they had been there for years. Mystery stood for a few moments, completely frozen to the spot. Eventually, she found the courage to reach out and touch one of the railings, to ensure this wasn't just her imagination. She looked over to her right across the road before taking several steps toward the apartments opposite. These all looked slightly different than they did only moments ago. It was hard to put her finger on it, but these buildings now looked somewhat unoccupied. She then noticed a tall man dressed in grey stood in one of the doorways. Mystery called out to him, "Hello, can you help me?" The man quickly shook his head. He looked terrified as he seemed to gaze past her into the darkness beyond the park railings. He slammed the door of his apartment, and what sounded like several security bolts snapped shut behind him. There were no more further signs of life in these apartment buildings. There were no lights, no movements, and clearly no one to help her here. She gulped. What on earth is going on? She thought to herself. Sighing again, Mystery looked over once more towards the entrance. From the street, it looked like nothing, a simple choice. She nervously made her way forward across the road and through the gates of the park. She hoped that walking through may eventually lead her back to the ever-familiar streets, but she wasn't confident. There was an absolute stillness and an eerie darkness beyond those railings. The planting and trees looked as if they'd been there forever. How is this even possible? She thought. No one can plant trees overnight. She pinched herself and instantly felt pain. She knew she was awake, but somehow felt the need to reassure herself of this. The park looked as if it went out for acres into the distance. Large empty fields seemed to disappear amongst the trees into the darkness beyond. It had to have replaced hundreds of streets that had been there that morning. She recalled a group of trees where she lived, a tiny wooded area with a small lake, but this certainly could not have been mistaken for this place. She followed the path ahead of her through the park. There were rusting park benches on both sides of the path. It gently curved its way around past a large bandstand. Grotesque, Gothic-style statues lined the path's edge, all of them heavily worn with a slightly green tinge to them. As Mystery passed each one, they grew increasingly more ominous in their nature, and then one of them in particular shocked her. It was a very tall statue of a demonic-looking man, holding what looked like small children in his tightly clasped left hand. The small children appeared to be fighting, as if they were desperately trying to escape his grip. It had an unnaturally stretched, wide-open mouth, as if the statue itself was screaming in pain. The demonic-looking man appeared to be looking up at the heavens. Two tightly pinched fingers on his other hand seemed to be dropping a screaming child into his gaping mouth. She did not like the eyes on this statue. She felt as if its eyes moved with her as she cautiously approached it. She took her eyes briefly off it to read the engraved plaque below the statue. "Devouring you, one by one." She gulped, then took several steps back before taking a photo of the statue on her phone. A sudden wild gust of wind travelled through the trees and startled her. The leaves rustled angrily, as if nature itself was somehow trying to warn her. She looked up at the densely packed trees that were towering above her. She now knew how those children felt. She stood there in silence for a moment, in the darkness that stole even her own form. In the distance, sitting on a rusting park bench, was a figure, and Mystery at last found solace in the fact that there was someone else who could possibly help her. She began to approach the figure that calmly sat there on the park bench. As she got closer, she could see he was sat peacefully with his hands on his knees. There was something very creepy about the demeanour of this man as he sat there in silence. Her pace walking towards him gently slowed down until she stopped abruptly. She found herself getting deeper into this ominous park, which now looked as if it had no end. As far as she could see, there was no familiar streets to be found here, and speaking to a creepy man sat in the darkness on a bench was certainly not an option for her. She made yet another decision and turned around to head back the way she came. As she turned around to head towards the exit of the park, she came face to face with someone that had been standing directly behind her. She startled her at first and gasped in shock before resting her hand over her now pounding heart. There stood before her was a beautiful woman with bright green, almost luminous eyes. "I am 5, she said. "Do you need the service?" Mystery looked puzzled by the question and shook her head. "Sorry, I don't understand. I need a way out of here. Do you know where we are? Where this place is?" "You're down in the park," said 5, "and I am a friend." Mystery looked the young woman up and down. She was very innocent looking, extremely beautiful. Her skin tone radiated and was almost pure. Had she been stood perfectly still, she could have been confused for a shop mannequin. She was fascinated by her soft lips as she spoke, although she couldn't quite put her finger on it. They almost didn't look real. 5 suddenly raised her right arm up and pointed towards a rocky path that seemed to disappear into the darkness ahead of her. "Can you see?" she asked. Mystery strained her eyes in the direction 5 was pointing and saw nothing but darkness. She was becoming more confused. She wondered if this place was part of some mental hospital. Had she simply took a wrong turning and power walked her way out of the city? She laughed to herself, realizing how ridiculous this sounded. 5 stood perfectly still, pointing out towards the rocky path that now looked more visible. Mystery could now clearly see the path was littered with dirt and decaying leaves. They gently blew along in the same direction that she was pointing towards. Five turned to look at Mystery, looking somewhat concerned. "You should have stayed away from the machines," she said. Mystery looked at her blankly, feeling more and more confused. She took her mobile phone out from her pocket and began to explain to Five that she had no signal. Five looked down at her phone bewildered, as if she'd never seen one before. Mystery tried to call yet another number whilst pacing around holding her phone high up in the air. "See, if I try and call, there's just nothing. No reception, no signal," she said. When she turned around again, Five had simply vanished. She looked in the direction that Five had pointed at. Had Five just made her way down this rocky path? She cautiously made her way forward. The path led up to a massive steel chamber door. The chamber itself seemed to have been built into the side of some form of man-made structure, surrounded by aging concrete walls. Mystery heard the sound of water dripping heavily somewhere around the opening. She walked up to the chamber door to find it was sealed firmly shut. She ran her fingers over the huge, round steel door, which had to be over a metre thick. She was then slowly drawn towards the sound of the water. It dripped into a lake somewhere further around from the chamber door. She made her way through the undergrowth and came across something that she finally recognised. This small body of water was amongst the now familiar trees and wooded area that locals called Jagged Edge. She knew instantly then that she wasn't too far away from her home. The only thing was, the familiar streets and houses were still no longer there. She stood frozen in the undergrowth for a few moments, while she considered what to do next. She walked along the edge of the lake, which glistened, the moon mirrored on its delicate surface. This was the only familiar thing here, although the shrubbery and planting were somehow wilder and much more dense than she recalled. As she walked towards the wooded area, she could hear the sound of children laughing from between the trees. "It's far too late for children to be playing out here in the park," she thought. She slowly began to make her way towards the sound of the children laughing and giggling. She could see there was a small playground through the line of the trees just opposite the lake. She could hear a piercing, almost mechanical noise. It painfully creaked and grinded. It was the sound of a rusty old swing. The slow creaks of the swing were such an awful sound. It sent shivers down her spine. As she got closer, she noticed there was a small boy sat on the splintered wooden seat, swinging away gently. He held on tightly to the long, rusting chains as this unbearable squeaking sound echoed, almost deafening the eerie night. "He's probably laughing at me, wondering what I'm doing here," she thought, as she looked over towards the little boy, smiling at him. The little boy in the semi-darkness seemed unsurprised by her presence. As she clumsily appeared from behind the tree line, she approached him carefully to avoid startling him. The little boy seemed to swing gently back and forth in complete silence. She looked around for the other children that she had heard laughing and giggling. She couldn't see them, though the rustling of leaves around her told her they were probably somewhere nearby. She only had a side view of the little boy as she slowly approached him and smiled. "Hi there, I'm lost. I wonder if you can help me," she said. Then her smile turned to horror as she finally faced him and saw that there was only half of this child on the swing. She screamed when she realized that the child's body had been split completely up the middle. His tiny hand and arm that held onto the chains of the swing were merely only trapped within its links. The boy's only leg was contorted, unnaturally twisted to one side, and his entrails hung from the wooden seat of the swing. Blood seemed to splatter in a perfect line as his body swung back and forth. She continued to scream frantically, getting louder with each panicked howl. Suddenly, there were movements all around her. The bushes and undergrowth appeared to wave, as if something was about to lunge out of the darkness at her. This came in the form of crazies who suddenly scurried towards her on all fours along the ground. They grabbed her by her ankles, their hands instantly all over her. They flipped her over completely to the floor, the back of her head striking the ground hard, stunning her. She felt dirty, grimy, greasy, bony fingers all over her torso as she violently kicked and fought against them. As Mystery pushed each one of them away from her, they were quickly replaced by others who now seemed to pour out from the ground itself. She looked over towards a group of crazies who were now pulling at what was left of the little boy's body on the swing. She watched them tug violently the little boy's torso until his hand that had been caught in the links finally slipped out. The child's body was then quickly dragged away into the foliage. He seemed to bounce several times off the rocks before finally disappearing into a hole beneath the ground. Then they all turned their attention back to her. One of them tried to silence her screams by thrusting his dirty hand deep into her throat. She gagged almost immediately, and now felt the sensation of these vicious, animalistic creatures, as they were now pulling at her body in different directions. The opposing forces fought against each other. She felt as if her limbs were being torn from her. One pulled her in the direction of where the trail of blood from the young boy led, whilst another pulled her towards the lake. She got a very quick glimpse of what the crazies looked like. They had an almost tribal white cross symbol that ran from forehead down to the bridge of their noses. She violently kicked out at one of them full on in the face, sending it screeching back into the darkness. She screamed. Then there was a noise that she could only describe as unearthly. It was a mechanical noise, a loud whirring of a machine that sounded very close by. Moments later, the noise was coming from every direction, getting closer, louder, and more frantic. The crazies became wide-eyed and terrified, for they knew this noise too well. Instantly they let loose of their grip on Mystery, allowing her to scramble quickly to her feet. Whatever this noise was, it terrified them even more than it did her. She knew instinctively then that no matter what, she had to run. She had to escape this hell. She ran as fast as she could towards the lake. Her eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and she could now clearly see there were bodies everywhere, several of them floating in the lake. She could hear the machine getting closer to her as she ran. She could hear the breaking of branches all around her as whatever was behind her was quickly gaining on her. She scampered between the trees, stumbling over roots before being thrown headfirst into the thorny bushes and undergrowth. She stood quickly, before running blindly in fear, zigzagging away from her pursuer, and then the noise suddenly stopped. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Had this machine, this thing that was chasing her, finally lost sight of her? She took a moment to catch her breath, then cautiously and quietly passed the ominous-looking chamber. She crept forward slowly through the thorny bushes, till she reached the start of a rocky path. She ran her fingers through her hair and felt the back of her head, which was now wet. She knew this had to be blood from where her head had hit the ground. She was now faced with the option of going back, or passing the man who sat so calmly on the bench. Her decision was simple, because there was no going back. She would have to pass the man on the bench. It was the quickest and most direct way out of this park. She cautiously began to walk through the tangled undergrowth, every snap of a twig beneath her feet now sounding incredibly loud. Then she suddenly froze. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise when she realized she wasn't alone. She could feel a presence stood directly to her left. The kind of presence you feel when someone stands too close to you, invading your personal space. Her breathing became shallow, and she felt too frightened to move. She was shaking with fear as she very slowly turned her head towards whoever or whatever was stood next to her. She was surprised to find there was a tall, blonde-haired man, dressed completely in black, with black eyeliner stood right next to her. He was not like the other things that she had seen in this park. This man was strikingly beautiful against this evil backdrop. She saw that the blonde-haired man had a black shirt and black tie. He also wore a metal dog tag around his neck. She tilted her head to one side to read what it said. The Replican. He instantly raised his arm and pointed out into the undergrowth before turning towards her and saying, "Do you wonder if we could find us from here?" She could see his black nail-varnished fingers pointing down at a cluster of boulders. She assumed that perhaps this man was more likely to be a ghost. Was it his body buried here? She took a deep breath and nervously crouched down to run her hands over the boulders that he was pointing towards. The fear in her was now starting to escalate. "I'll get help," she said. "I'll find someone to help you." She began to slowly back away from him. Mystery then nervously turned around and pushed her way through the thorny bushes out onto the rocky path. She was hoping he wasn't going to be following her. She had lost sight of him. He seemed to have been swallowed by the undergrowth as she cautiously backed away from the bushes. She kept her eyes fixed on where she thought he was stood. It didn't matter what was in front of her, as long as she knew what was behind her. There was a brief, eerie silence, which was then broken by the sounds of the undergrowth around her rustling. She felt the presence and smell of those vicious creatures around her once more. The crazies scurried towards her on all fours, and she quickly darted out of the way from them, further onto the rocky path ahead of her. There was a gentle hum of a machine. The moment she found herself on solid ground, the scurrying around her and the rustling of leaves immediately ceased. The path wound round towards the man on the bench. She could see he was completely dressed in black. She was shaking with fear along with the biting cold as she slowly approached him. She was becoming increasingly concerned about what or who was around her now. "Can you help me?" she pleaded. "I think I'm seeing ghosts, or I'm going mad or something." There was no reply from him. The closer she got to the man that sat so calmly on the bench, the more nervous she became. She could clearly see he was looking over to his right, towards the exit of the park, but did not say a word. As she got within arm's length away from him, he turned towards her. She let out another almighty scream. There was a reason why there was no words from this man, for he had no face. No eyes, ears or mouth whatsoever. A blank, faceless man. He somehow seemed to be aware of her, stood in front of him. She now ran, screaming in sheer terror towards the exit, dropping her phone, her heart now pounding in her chest. She quickly glanced over her shoulder at the faceless man, somehow expecting him to disappear like the other figures she had seen in the park. He was still sat there calmly on the bench. She saw the bandstand ahead of her, and that's when she caught sight of the scurrying around her once more. The rustling came from every direction. Over to her left, she saw that the crazies were now dragging something bloodied and heavy towards a hole beneath the park itself. It was a young man, and she instantly recognized him. It was her boyfriend being dragged away into the undergrowth. He was attempting to scream, but she couldn't hear his cries. "Why are you here?" she cried out. Suddenly, her boyfriend's eyes closed, his jaw dropped, and his blood-stained mouth gaped wide before he finally submitted to the crazies. His carcass was then quickly tugged by them towards a large, dark hole in the ground. "I'm dreaming. I have to be dreaming. This has to be a nightmare," she repeated to herself over and over again. "It can't be him. This can't be happening," she said. She ran towards him to help, but he was being dragged away far too quickly from her. She was suddenly stopped dead in her tracks by the sound of screams from a woman she also recognized. Somewhere behind her, her boyfriend's body disappeared between a garish quilt of leaves and a hollow thudding sound into the hole in the ground as she slowly turned. All of her ability to move had completely ceased because she recognized that scream as her own. She reluctantly turned around, and when she did, she was faced with several machines manically trying to pin a woman to the ground. Huge metal pincers clamped around the woman's ankles, and all Mystery could do was watch the unfolding events frozen to the spot. It wasn't what they were doing that terrified her. It was who the machines were doing it to. They were dragging what appeared to be her into the clearing. She let out yet another almighty scream and began to run as fast as she could towards the exit of the park that was now directly ahead of her. There was a sign that said, "No exit. No one can save you here," and that is the direction she headed for. Moments later she heard an unearthly howl in the darkness, her own cry of death. Every limb in her body cried out for her to run as fast as she could. There, directly ahead of her was her salvation, the exit of the park. She ran past the statue of the devoured, praying that this was not her time. She could see the heavy mist now completely engulfed the perimeter of this park, but she didn't care. She knew that this was her only escape. She had this overwhelming feeling of relief as she got to the exit. This was replaced by instant shock and fear, as a tall, heavy-built man in a long coat, grey hat stepped out of the mist that surrounded him like a dark cloud, directly in front of her at the gates. She ran into the man, then took a step backwards, only to find herself violently hoisted up by her throat. What had stepped out of the darkness to grab her was a Macman. He instantly gripped her, raising her slight frame up high into the air. Her feet dangled helplessly below her as she desperately gasped for air. She looked down into his soulless face of pure evil, and black, empty eyes stared back, cold and devoid of any emotion. "I am the darkness that crawls into you," he said as he moved his vice-like grip around her effortlessly. She dangled around above him as if she was nothing more than a cloth doll. She attempted a choked cry for help, but all the Macman did was wryly smile back at her. She felt a teardrop slowly release itself, trickling down her cheek. She knew the end was near. She frantically clawed at his arms, face and hair, kicking out wildly, but to no avail. She felt as if this man who held her was made of metal. She finally conceded, looking deep into his eyes, accepting the inevitable, as she could feel her life slowly slipping away. Heavy tears now began to roll down her cheeks. "Real tears," he said as he admired his prey for the final time. "Real human tears excite me," he said, "for I cry rust." He pulled his right hand back suddenly to gain enough power behind it to thrust his metal hand deep into her stomach, so he could start ripping her entrails away from her as she hung there helplessly in his grip. He looked deep into her eyes and smiled like a dead thing smiles. "Everything bleeds," he growled. She closed her eyes tightly, waiting for the searing pain from his strike, which never came. The Macman's cruel, contorted face was there 1 minute, and the next moment, part of his face seemed to just simply peel away in fragments. She felt her full body weight fall instantly to the floor. She gasped for air, rubbing her eyes, looking all around her for the man in the long coat and grey hat. But he was now gone. She was left crumpled on the floor, cowering and whimpering as several concerned people from neighbouring apartments quickly approached her. She nervously turned around to look back at the entrance of the park behind her. All she saw now were familiar streets. The entrance to this ominous, evil park were for now, like all those other horrors, gone.